The storm had been screaming for 2 days straight. Gideon Thorne sat close enough to the stove that the iron burned through his shirt, and still his boots held cold. Outside, Bitter Creek Ridge had gone white and blind. The pines had disappeared. The trail had disappeared. Everything had disappeared except the sound, that low, flat roar that pressed against the cabin walls like something alive and mean. He hadn't spoken a word in 11 days. Hadn't needed to. The knock came so hard the door shook in its frame. He was on his feet before he knew it, the Winchester already in his hand, the hammer already pulled. Nobody rode up Bitter Creek in a storm like this. Nobody who meant well, anyway. He yanked the door open. The cold hit him like a fist. She stood on the porch with ice in her hair and blood on her collar, and 3 horses behind her in the white. The horses were spent, heads down, legs trembling, flanks heaving steam into the dark. The girl was not spent. Her clothes were torn at the shoulder and soaked through, and her lips had gone the color of a bruise. But her eyes were black and level, and they did not blink. She was maybe 19, maybe younger. He said nothing. His grip on the Winchester tightened. She said, "My father told me you wanted children." The wind screamed between them. Gideon had not moved in 10 years. Not truly moved, not past the muscle and bone of it, not in the place where men keep the things that broke them. He had learned to live inside that stillness, the way a man learns to live inside a scar. It wasn't comfort. It was just the shape of him now. Her words went through it like a nail through dry wood. He stared at her. His jaw worked once and stopped. She reached inside her coat with a hand that had bled through the wrapping on 2 fingers and pulled out a letter. The paper was dark, wet in places that weren't rain or snow. She held it out. He didn't take it. "He is dead," she said. "Read the letter." He took it. The horses behind her swayed. One of them, a blue roan Appaloosa with a white blanket spotted like thrown ash, turned its head and looked at Gideon with one dark eye. The animal's breathing was ragged. Another hour in this cold, and it wouldn't be breathing at all. Gideon looked at the letter. The handwriting was thin and pressed hard, a man writing fast or writing with pain in his hands. The ink had run in 2 places, but the name at the top was clear enough. Gideon Thorne, the only man in the territory who would have written that name, the only man in the territory who had a right to. Gideon's thumb pressed flat against the page. The paper crinkled. He had told himself many times in the 10 years since that he had paid that debt. He had told himself it so many times it had almost started to feel true. The girl on his porch had not moved. She was watching him with those level eyes, and there was something in the set of her jaw, not pleading, not rage, something harder than both, that told him she had already decided she would stand there until the storm took her, before she would beg. He looked at the horses. He looked at the letter. He stepped back from the door. "Get them in the barn," he said. "Far stalls. There's hay." She did not thank him. She turned back into the storm and took hold of the lead rope and walked those 3 ruined horses through 2 feet of snow without a word. He watched her go until the white swallowed her. Then he stood alone in his doorway with a dead man's letter in his hand, the cold pouring in around his legs, and read what Nesha Running Water had written to him in the last hours of his life. By the 3rd line, Gideon's hand had stopped moving. By the 6th, he had forgotten the cold entirely. She was already awake when he got up. He didn't know what hour it was. The storm had stolen the light. But when Gideon pushed open the barn door at what felt like 4 in the morning, Najoni was crouched over the water trough with a hand axe breaking the ice that had sealed it overnight. She swung clean, and even the blade catching what little lantern light there was. Her breath came out in short white bursts. She did not look up. He stood in the doorway long enough to feel foolish, then went back inside. He read the letter again over coffee he didn't taste. Nasha had written it in 2 parts. The first part was for his daughter. Gideon could tell by the tenderness of it the way the handwriting slowed. He didn't read that part twice. The second part was for him. What they're doing to us is legal, Gideon. That's the ugliest part. Bartholomew found a judge who'll sign anything with enough silver behind it. Najoni has no standing in their courts. No papers, no husband, no deed. Under their law, she is property to be seized, same as an unbranded horse. I'm asking you to be the wall between her and that. Not out of pity, out of what you owe me. You know what you owe me. Gideon set the letter down. He knew. He went to the window and looked out at the barn. Through the gap in the doors, he could see the lantern still burning. He had told her the terms the night before, flat and without apology. She would sleep in the tack room. She would earn her keep. The moment the storm broke and the trail opened, she could ride out, and he would make no claim on the horses. She had listened. Then she had said, "And the horses stay here through winter. If you work for it, I will work for it." He had expected her to struggle with the cold. Most people did, even men who'd lived on the ridge for years. The cold up here wasn't just temperature, it was weight. It pressed down on everything. It made simple tasks take 3 times as long and cost 3 times as much. Najoni did not struggle. She moved through the cold the way water moves through rock, not fighting it, just finding the path. She set snare lines in the timber before he'd even thought to check the traps. She knew which deadfall to use for which animal. She packed the gaps in the barn wall with a mud and grass mix she'd made herself, cutting the wind so the horses stopped shivering by the 3rd night. Her hands bled. He saw the cracked skin along her knuckles, the 2 fingers she'd wrapped back in the barn. She never mentioned it. She wrapped them tighter in the mornings and went back out. He stopped waiting for her to quit somewhere around day 6. By day 10, he had started leaving her coffee on the porch before she came in for the night. She never thanked him for it. He told himself he didn't want her to. On the 14th morning, he found 4 of his cattle down. Not just down wrong. Foam at the lips, legs kicking at nothing, eyes rolled back to white. He lost one before noon. The others were going fast, the sickness moving through them the way fire moves through dry grass, low and quick and unstoppable. He stood in the pen with his hand on the neck of a steer that had been healthy 3 days ago and felt the heat coming off the animal in sick waves. Najoni appeared at the fence rail. She looked at the cattle. She looked at the snow around the water trough, the yellow tinge at the edges, the way the ice had a faint film on it that hadn't been there last week. Her jaw set hard. She said, "Someone put something in the creek." He looked at her. "I need your axe," she said, "and every clean bucket you have, and I need you to stay out of my way." She was already moving toward the timber before he answered. By nightfall, the cattle were worse. By midnight, she was still working her shadow crossing the lantern light over and over in the barn window. And Gideon sat on the porch in the killing cold and watched and could not think of one useful thing to do. He had not felt that way in a long time. He wasn't sure he liked it. She saved all 4 of them. Gideon watched it happen and still couldn't fully account for it. 3 days she didn't sleep. Not real sleep. Maybe an hour here and there slumped against a stall post before she pushed herself back up. She stripped bark from the willows along the creek, boiled it down, mixed it with something black and gritty. She'd packed in a cloth pouch in her saddlebag. She pried open each animal's jaw herself and poured it in slow, holding the head steady, talking low in a language he didn't know. By the third morning, all 4 cattle were standing. Gideon didn't say anything when she came in. He just put a plate of salt pork and cornbread on the table and went outside to give her the room. When he came back, the plate was clean and she was asleep sitting up in the chair, her chin on her chest, both hands still wrapped in strips of his old flannel shirt. He put a blanket over her shoulders and stood there longer than he needed to. They came 8 days later. Gideon heard the horses before he saw them, too many, moving too slow, the way men move when they want you to know they're coming and want you to sweat over it. He was at the woodpile when they crested the ridge. 6 riders, Bartholomew in front. The sheriff was a big man, going soft in the middle, with a silver star on his coat, and small eyes that never quite settled on anything directly. He rode up to the yard fence and stopped and looked around the property, the way a man looks at something he's already decided belongs to him. Najoni came out of the barn, Bartholomew's mouth curved. Well, still here. 2 of his men dismounted without being told. One of them walked to the water bucket by the barn door and kicked it over. The water spread black across the frozen ground. He did it like it meant nothing, like it was just something his boot had done. Heard you been having trouble with your stock, Thorn. Bartholomew's eyes moved to Najoni. Funny thing, trouble starting up right when you got yourself astray. Ride back down, Gideon said. Just a wellness check. Bartholomew leaned on his saddle horn. You know what the law says about harboring individuals with no legal standing. Apache woman's got no deed, no papers, no citizen rights. Anything she touches becomes disputed property. He paused. Anything bad happens to your herd, well, courts will want to know who had access. Gideon's hand moved toward the Winchester on the porch rail. Najoni stepped between him and it. She didn't touch him. She just put herself in the way, her back to Gideon. Her face turned up toward Bartholomew, and the look she gave the sheriff was so flat and so cold, it stopped the man's smirk for just a half-second before he put it back. Gideon understood. He understood it in his gut before his head caught up. If he raised that rifle, Bartholomew had everything he needed. A hostile act on a lawman. Both of them swinging before the week was out. Bartholomew let the silence sit, then clicked his tongue and wheeled his horse. Snow's thinning up on the north face. Give it 3 weeks. He didn't look back. I'll bring the wagon. They rode out laughing. The sound of it carried a long time in the cold air. Najoni watched them go. Her shoulders didn't drop. Her breathing didn't change. She bent down, picked up the overturned bucket, and walked to the creek to refill it. That night, Gideon woke at 2 in the morning to the lantern moving in the barn. He got up and looked and saw her through the gap in the doors, still working, checking each animal, checking the water, resetting the bark medicine to steep. She had heard the same thing he had heard. 3 weeks. He lay back down and stared at the ceiling and did the arithmetic on 3 weeks and came up with nothing good. Bartholomew had a signed order. He had 10 guns. He had the law written so that Najoni didn't exist inside it, except as something to be seized. What Gideon had was a Winchester 40 rounds and a debt to a dead man. He was still staring at the ceiling when the answer came to him. It was not a good answer. It was not the kind of answer a man arrives at, easy, but it was the only one that would hold. He sat up, reached for his boots. Chapter 4. The Edge of Despair. The snow had been pulling back for 4 days when they came. Gideon heard them while the sky was still gray, the sound of 10 horses moving together, not fast, not slow, the sound of men who had already won and knew it. He was at the window when they cleared the tree line, Bartholomew in front, same as before. But this time there was a wagon behind him, iron wheels, bars on the sides. Nizoni came to stand beside him at the window. Neither of them spoke. He counted the riders. Then he counted again. 10 guns plus Bartholomew. The wagon driver made 12. Gideon reached for the Winchester. "I know," he said, before she could say anything. "I know." He went out onto the porch, and she came with him, and they stood there together in the thin spring light, while 12 men spread out in a loose arc around the yard. Bartholomew rode to the fence and pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it up like it was something holy. Territorial order signed by Judge Callum Prest. His voice was the voice of a man who had rehearsed this. Seizure of 1 Apache female, name unknown, and 3 Appaloosa horses, property status disputed. All goods and persons named herein are remanded to territorial custody pending settlement. One of the riders had already dismounted and was moving toward the corral gate. Nizoni's hand went to the knife at her belt. Gideon felt it happen before he saw it, the way her arm shifted, the way her weight settled back onto her heels. He knew what it meant. He'd seen men make the same decision before. The knife wasn't for Bartholomew. It was for herself. She would not get in that wagon. She had made that decision somewhere quiet inside herself, and it was already done. His chest locked up. Bartholomew smiled. It was the smile of a man who had seen this before too, and had never once lost. "Put the rifle down, Thorne. You start shooting, I got 9 men to finish it before you work the lever twice. Girl dies, you die, and I still take the horses. Only difference is, I don't have to do the paperwork." The rider at the corral gate swung it open. The blue roan Appaloosa shied back, ears flat. Gideon leveled the Winchester at Bartholomew's chest. His hands were steady. His breathing was steady. Somewhere underneath that, he felt something that had no name, not rage, something older and darker than rage. The thing a man feels when he looks at the arithmetic and every answer comes up the same. Bartholomew raised his hand. 8 rifles came up. The yard went absolutely still. No wind, no birds, just the sound of the roan moving in the corral and Nizoni's breath slow and controlled beside him. She pulled the knife free of its sheath. The blade caught the pale morning light. Gideon looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking straight ahead, jaw set, and her hand on that knife was not shaking. He looked at the cattle in the pen, heavy and healthy coats, thick. The horses in the corral. The barn with its new-packed walls. The herb bundles drying under the porch eave that hadn't been there 4 months ago. He looked at all of it and felt something shift in him like a floorboard giving way. He lowered the Winchester. The barrel came down slow. He let his arm drop to his side. He heard one of the riders let out a short laugh. Nizoni's head turned toward him. One sharp movement. The look on her face cut right through him. Bartholomew stepped down from his horse. He was smiling with his whole face, now the smile of a man who had been right about something for a long time. He straightened his coat and walked through the gate and started across the yard. "Smart choice, Thorne," he said. "Smart." Gideon reached into his coat. The paper was folded in thirds, the way a man folds something he's carried a long time. Gideon pulled it from his inside coat pocket and held it out flat in the open air, not handing it to Bartholomew, just holding it where everyone in that yard could see it. The red wax seal of the Territorial Registry Office sat dead center, unbroken, dark as a wound. Bartholomew stopped walking. His eyes went to the paper, then to Gideon's face. The smile was still there, but it had gone careful around the edges. "She is not without standing," Gideon said. His voice came out flat and even, the way a man speaks when he has thought a thing through until all the heat burned off it. "She is my wife. Has been for 3 weeks." Nobody moved. The rider at the corral gate stood with his hand on the post and did not move. The 8 men with rifles up did not move. Bartholomew did not move. Gideon took 2 steps forward and held the paper out and let it go. It hit Bartholomew in the chest and fell. The sheriff caught it before it reached the ground, a reflex, the hand moving before the brain decided to, and that small, helpless grab was the most satisfying thing Gideon had seen in 10 years. "Her property is my property," Gideon said. "Her horses are my horses. Any man who puts a hand on what belongs to the Thorne homestead, I will shoot him off my land and sleep easy after." Bartholomew unfolded the paper. He read it. He read it again. The color in his face shifted the high red of a man who had been sure of something and is now doing fast, ugly arithmetic in his head. The seal was real. The date was real. 3 weeks ago, Gideon had ridden 2 days through the last of the winter cold to the territorial capital, filed the paperwork with the registry clerk, paid the $2 fee, and ridden 2 days back. He had told Najoni none of it. He had come back and put the folded paper in his coat and gone back to work and said nothing. He had not been certain she would want it known. He wasn't certain now. He made himself not look at her. Bartholomew's jaw worked. He looked up from the paper. He looked at his men. He looked back at Gideon with something in his small eyes that was not quite rage and not quite fear, but lived in the country between them. "Judge pressed. Can read the territorial marriage statute same as you." Gideon picked up the Winchester from where he'd leaned it against the fence post, not raising it, just holding it. "A wife holds full property standing through her husband's deed. That is the law, your law, the one you wrote up here to use." He let that sit for a moment. "You want to go back down to Blackwood and explain to Judge Prest why his order don't apply. You go ahead and do that." Bartholomew stood in the yard with the paper in his hand, and 12 men watching him, and nothing to do with any of it. The rider at the corral gate stepped back and swung it quietly shut. One by one, without a word from Bartholomew, the rifles came down. The sheriff folded the paper once, sharp and hard, along a crease that wasn't there before. He looked at Najoni for a long moment. She looked back at him without the knife in her hand. She had put it away, at some point Gideon hadn't seen when, and her face was so still it could have been cut from the same rock the cabin sat on. Bartholomew dropped the paper in the dirt, turned back to his horse, climbed up. He rode out without speaking. His men followed. The wagon, last iron wheels grinding slow over the wet ground. Gideon watched until they were back in the tree line. Then he turned around. Najoni was standing 6 feet away, looking at him. Her expression was not what he had expected. Not relief, not gratitude. Something slower than that, and deeper, the look of a person recalculating something they thought they already understood. The yard was quiet, except for the roan moving in the corral. 3 weeks ago, she said. It wasn't a question. Night after they came the first time. She looked at the tree line where the riders had gone, then back at him. "You did not tell me." "Didn't know if it would work," he said. "Didn't want to." He stopped, started over. "Didn't want you counting on something that might not hold." She was quiet a long time. Then, "My father knew you would do something like this." Gideon picked up Bartholomew's paper from the dirt and folded it back along its original lines. He held it out to her. "Yours to keep," he said, "or burn, whichever suits you." She took it. Her fingers closed over it slowly, like something she intended to hold on to. By September, the trail up Bitter Creek Ridge had a rut worn into it. Gideon noticed it one morning in the way he noticed most things now quietly without making much of it. The rut was 8 inches deep in the soft stretch past the second creek crossing. Wagon wheels. Coming up, not going down. 3 months of them. The first had been a Thursday in late April. Harlan Deese, from the feed store, hat in hand, asking in a voice stripped of everything it used to carry whether Najoni might have any of the joint medicine left, the kind she'd sold to the Kettrick woman for her husband's hands. He'd brought silver. He set it on the porch rail without being asked. Nizoni had looked at the silver, then at Dees. She took the silver and went inside and came back with a cloth pouch tied with cord and told him the instructions once clearly without repeating herself. Dees said thank you 3 times on his way back to his wagon. After he'd gone, Gideon stood in the yard and felt something move through his chest that he didn't try to name. By June, there were 2 wagons a week. By August, 4. They came for the medicines. First, the willow bark compound, the dried root bundles, the poultices she made from plants. Gideon couldn't identify that grew in the rocky soil above the tree line where nothing else would. Then they started coming for the horses. The blue roan threw a foal in July. Gray-white legs like new fence posts, spots scattered across the hindquarters like a handful of thrown stones. Word got down to Blackwood fast, then past Blackwood. A man rode up from Cimarron just to look. He looked for 20 minutes, and then he made an offer that Gideon would not have believed 3 months ago. Najoni heard the number and said she would think on it. She thought on it for 2 days, and then she negotiated him up by a third. Gideon had been at the fence watching that conversation happen and had to turn away before the man saw his face. On an evening in late September, the last wagon of the week came and went before sundown, and the ridge went quiet the way it only did in autumn. A deep, clean quiet. The aspens already yellow, the first cold coming down off the high country, on a wind that smelled like iron and pine. Gideon sat by the stove. Najoni was at the table behind him writing figures in the ledger she'd started keeping in May. The scratch of the pencil, the fire settling. Outside, the horses moving slow in the corral. He thought about the letter. He thought about Nasha, writing it in whatever pain he'd been in at the end, pressing hard on the paper, spending his last clear hours on something he needed to say to a man he'd saved 10 years ago on a muddy road outside Tucson. What Nasha had understood that Gideon hadn't, not until now, not until he sat in this room that smelled like dried herbs and wood smoke and horse, and something that had no name except that it was the opposite of what this place had smelled like in January. Nasha hadn't sent her here to solve a problem. He'd sent her here because he knew what she would build, because he knew maybe better than Gideon ever had that there was still something in Gideon Thorne worth building around. He said without turning, "You don't have to stay." The pencil stopped. "The paper's yours," he said. "The horses are yours. You've got buyers now and enough silver to deed land wherever you choose. You don't owe this place anything." He kept his eyes on the stove. "You don't owe me anything." The fire popped once. He heard her set the pencil down. Then the chair moved and her weight was on the bench beside him, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he went very still. Outside, the roan moved through the corral in the last of the light, her foal close at her flank. Najoni said nothing. She didn't need to. Gideon put his arm around her slowly, the way a man moves when he's afraid a thing is not real and does not want to be the one to prove it. But she was there, solid and warm and entirely real, her breath evening out, her hand resting open on her knee. He looked at the room around them, the herb bundles, the ledger, the foal's wool blanket folded on the shelf she'd built herself from scrap pine, neat and square against the wall. Her father had sent her here with 3 exhausted horses and a blood-soaked letter, and 1 sentence that had cracked 10 years of ice in a single blow. Gideon finally understood what that sentence had really meant. Not what he could give her, what she would grow. The fire burned low, and neither of them moved to add wood, and the dark came in gentle around the cabin on the ridge and held them there quiet inside it. the roots of something neither one of them had a name for, yet going down deep and slow into the rock beneath their feet.